Cool. All right, we're going to change gears slightly. Up next, we have a sort of a panel conversation on the topic of governance, using blockchains for governance. It's moderated by Gabriel, who is a lawyer from the Web3 Foundation, so we have some legitimate legal experience as part of the conversation, which I appreciate. And our two panelists are Aron from Colony and Jorge from Aragon. Are you guys all ready to go? All right, come on up.
Thanks, Lane. Cheers. Okay, cool. Right, welcome. No real need for intros for you guys, and certainly not for Colony and Aragon. I'm going to ask questions that try and shine a light on some of the design processes and design thinking that you guys have been going through. How your particular governance solutions are going to come into being, what the principles that have been foremost in designing those. And I want to start with maybe a framing and tell me if this is right or wrong. So Web3 are obviously working on Polkadot with parity, and there is an on-chain governance element to that. In that, it's an interoperability protocol that, in order to work, has to have some governance, right? But the governance is in service of the protocol, right, to make sure it exists and evolves. You guys are in the business of designing governance frameworks for the use of any number of use cases and deployments in the world. So what design principles, when you're sitting there with your blank sheet of paper, however many months and years ago, did you apply in that first instance?
Well, Aragon started with a very specific use case. We were trying to put your typical Silicon Valley type startup in the on-chain, and we actually built very traditional governance models into that, just shareholder type voting. And when we kept advancing, we realized that we could actually have a lot of different organizations that organize in very, very different things, and that it was not the best idea to tie our entire system around a particular way of organizing, because we really don't know how organizing and governance on chain is going to go. So then we went back to the drawing paper, and we decided on building this new system called Aragon OS that it's built on top of the assumption that we don't really know what the best governance models are going to be, but we are leaving it open so that we can build very interesting governance models on top without having to change the entire architecture.
Yeah. So at Colony, one of the things we thought about very early is that even though we can use the blockchain to cook up all kinds of complicated procedures of votings and what have you, when it comes to day-to-day decision-making in, let's say, a club or a company, it's not all adversarial, and you don't always have to vote on everything. We wanted it to be fluid and permissive and easy to get things done. The procedure shouldn't get in the way. It shouldn't, occupy too much of your time. So we tried to find the right balance where it's really easy to get things done, to work together on projects, and sort of use the on-chain governance, the smart contracts that can enforce a procedure only as needed, so only when there's dispute, and so to try to find the right balance between that.
Mm-hmm. So they both have a sort of a thin design, a thin profile as possible to achieve the ends that you're trying to produce for people without necessarily being too dogmatic about how they achieve those ends. Is that?
Yeah, it should be very flexible to accommodate many different groups, many different. Well, you should be able to work as you want, and it should never stand. The governance framework should never stand in the way of consensus. If everyone agrees to do something, then it should be possible to do that. So it really is only... So these smart contracts and one of these frameworks, they should be able to help you move along. Sometimes you need some structure just to get a lot of people to move in a certain direction. But it should never be a hindrance. So there should always be a way to change whatever you've done before and go off in a different direction if there's wide consensus that you want to do that. So yeah, a smart contract can force procedure, but that's sort of the only thing they can do. Everything else has to come from the people using the procedure. So we still need people to communicate, to talk to each other, to have video chats, whatever. Like an on-chain vote is not a decision-making procedure, just a procedure that records a decision that has been made in conversations and outside of the framework.
Okay, so in terms of procedure, so the law, which is a background from which I come, has lots of them. It likes them, it fetishizes them in some ways. And there are tests for whether a decision was made well, certainly in England and Wales, the jurisdiction I come from, whereby if you haven't followed certain procedures, the decision is reviewable, right? And to some extent, if you are therefore making decisions which are not reviewable, so in other words, if you followed the non-bias rule, if you followed the rule to be weigh only good evidence and kick out bad evidence in the process of decision making, that's the formula for making good decisions. Are there 10 commandments of decision making that on-chain governance has something particular to say about, or do you borrow from these kind of existing scholastic or practical examples when you're building?
Yeah, I think something that pure on-chain governance, like if you have an organization full of pseudonymous entities, something that you miss from the traditional world is that because of everything is happening in the smart contracts, and if you follow the procedure, everything can happen. But there can be some sort of decisions. For example, if you have a traditional company, there cannot be a majority vote to kick out some minority and remove their shares from them. And this is something that we're missing, because like if the majority in an organization can do basically everything, you need to put some processes in place so that these minorities are protected, that in the real world you have protected. You cannot have people do these sort of things. So for this, there are like basically two different solutions that you can go with. One is allowing people to exit. So if the minority is like feeling oppressed by the majority, if before a decision is made, they can exit and take their proportional part of the assets of the organization with them. That protects them against like a majority. And then you have the other aspect of it, that is, okay, you can have like you can add human subjectivity into the mix. That a smart contract will never be able to tell you if the payment that you're about to do is like giving a share to all the people that voted yes, or is actually a quote-unquote legit investment for the organization. So for that, we feel very strongly that there's the need for like a human subjectivity oracle, or like a decentralized court, so that if there's a minority that is feeling oppressed and you cannot go to like a traditional court with a decentralized organization, they can rely on this entity to protect them from the oppressive minority.
And it's at that point that these concepts of whether what has gone on is fair and whether the right considerations have been given, that's where these come in, is it?
Yeah, I mean, this is like to evaluate some sort of like rules that you cannot encode in a smart contract, because for the smart contract it's just sending money to some place or another, but it's like you cannot evaluate what is going on in the smart contract. So you need like some sort of human evaluation of like some written rules in a paper or a PDF that everyone agreed to and said, okay, this is not allowed. Even if the smart contract theoretically allows it, we're not going to do that. And if this happens, someone can raise their voice and have a human, like a set of humans, evaluate that and have a process for stopping that from happening.
Yeah, I mean, I'd jump in on that. You said, like, you can check that law was passed according to the correct procedure, and if it wasn't, you can raise procedural points. Now, that's not really the problem with smart contracts, because the one thing they can ensure is that procedure gets executed as written regardless of content. But if you have agreements, sort of more lofty goals that a majority may never, do some. I mean, you don't want to have a dictatorship for the majority. So suppose you have some code of conduct and some kind of a decision gets made that's according to procedure, looks correct, but is against some rules that you sort of thought the community had agreed to, then it's not a procedural question. So we can ask, is there an arbitration or can there be an appeal? Right. And so if your smart contracts are coded to have an appeals clause that somebody can trigger and then the decision goes into arbitration, then that procedure will be followed. So to go to your point, yes, there is a space for this kind of reviewing decisions as they're made, but not for procedural questions, but for content. And in Colony, we do have a lot of these kind of ideas of you can appeal to a group to arbitrate on a decision, and unlike in a company where you can appeal to a higher boss, you can just appeal to a bigger and bigger group of people. So the appeals process is social. But yeah, in general, we can imagine that any decision-making governance procedure on Ethereum could have these exit clauses, which, if triggered, take some decision over into an appeals process, and you could have arbitration as a service you can plug into other governance systems. But yeah, it's never for procedural questions, because that's the one thing we can ensure that procedure is followed, including the arbitration procedure.
Okay. So then thinking about how, I mean, we didn't start this conversation with a question of what governance is and that boring, interminable issue, because so many different ways to take a cross-section of this, of what we're actually discussing. But let's say we've agreed that, there is on-chain governance, and there are going to be different approaches to it. And so those paradigms, do you have in mind a way for applying value judgments to, or comparing these different paradigms? And if so, what would those judgments be based on? So, you could say that a good for a governance system would be the way that it maintains integrity of the original community. Or you could say, this is a particularly good governance system because it makes nuanced decisions in a particular way. Are there things that strike you as better or worse in the design of these things?
I mean, I think the two most important aspects are, like, one is the process, like, are the people involved think the process is legitimate? And the second one, like, are the decisions that are being made by the governance process, like, good for the organization or the initial charter that organization wanted to make? So I think, like, measuring in these two variables are the most important aspects that you can do. But in terms of evaluating whether a governance process is good or bad, I think you can only test it in practice. Like, you can write a lot of papers and theorize how are people going to behave, and people are going to make good decisions. But the truth is, like, you can only experiment with it, see how people react, see when there's a disagreement, when there's a conflict, how it gets resolved, and whether the decisions that the organization is making through the governance process are actually good decisions and the organization flourishes.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's two things you should look at once these were launched and people are using them. Is one, are these tools being used to actually get stuff done? Like, can people use them to run a company, run a colony, and that colony actually has great projects and produces work? And the other thing I'd really look for is people who lose contentious decisions, do they stay within the system? So does the system retain legitimacy even to those people who have lost? So, I think there might be systems where if I lose, I'd say, this whole thing was rigged and unfair and I don't want to be part of this anymore. Or you might have the feeling, it was fair, I lost, but, we'll move on. So those are the sort of points we really want to hone in on, look for in the projects once they're launched, because that's sort of where the signal would first be that something's amiss if people don't feel that it's okay to lose, but the process itself is still legitimate.
So notwithstanding the fact that you lost your way was not voted, you respect the process sufficiently well to say, I'll stick with next time and, I don't know, propose different proposals and write it that way.
Yeah, when you don't go shouting for hard forks every time you lose, right? So legitimacy is sort of the acknowledgement that you will continue to use this decision-making procedure. Right.
So on the shouting point then, it's probably a fuzzy barrier between what is on-chain, what is, I mean, it's actually a very hard distinction, but, when you talk about a governance paradigm, generally, there's the very clearly smart contract governed parts of it, and then there's the shouting bits and the fuzzy bits around the side. What is the role for, people in the meat space, and how far can you isolate these two? How far is it desirable to isolate these two from each other?
I'd say one of the things that we don't really talk about enough in this Ethereum governance space is how to actually talk to each other, because we like talking about procedure and the stuff that you can encode in smart contracts, but sort of the role of a plenum, of a parliament, of a physical space where we talk to each other, or even online space where we talk to each other to come to decisions. We know that Reddit is terrible, we know that Twitter is terrible, but we don't really know what's good. So if we're working in a small team, and a lot of us are in small distributed teams, we probably have a daily stand-up channel or a weekly video chat, and once or twice a year we meet in person because it's so important to talk to each other, because that's when you learn about, in these conferences, you talk to people and you learn about other opinions that you would never have learned online, even though there's plenty of material out there, it's just too much noise. And so to complement any kind of procedure that we could encode in smart contracts, there is this whole other space of talking to each other and really debating issues so we can come to agreement, making a decision rather than just recording it. And that's a really important aspect. And this kind of, I understand why it's not so present in the discussion, because we're talking about how to implement the tools and the smart contracts, but sort of always assumed there's this other half of, we already know how to have video chats, so we don't need to rewrite that. We already know how to do calls and how to coordinate a team. But the larger and larger the project gets, and the larger your governance problem, the bigger that issue is, because the more distorting a few voices can be on Reddit and Twitter, and the more important it is to have like large plenary discussions, even structured ones. So that makes conferences like these really important, even though they don't leave a trace on the blockchain for like a governance procedure. The parliament has two functions: you talk about things, and then you execute a procedure to vote on them. And like we need to encompass both.
And so EIP 0, for example, is a good example of something. Aron was behind or one of the co-organizers of that, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, we helped organize the event, and that was very, very good to talk about, like, in particular, one very contentious issue on Ethereum, EIP 999. And it's I think, as Aron was saying, it's very clear that the online platforms that we're using for like communicating, and it's not an accurate representation of what people are thinking, and they're definitely not a place where ideas are like evolving and people are trying to talk to each other and like try to come to consensus on some ideas. Everyone's just like talking their book and like being very, very, very aggressive. So yeah, I totally agree that we definitely need a place for actually having these dialogues about like governance or decisions, and where people can try to like convince others, but like in a very nice way, not like I'm in this stream, you're in this stream, and we're just like shouting at each other. But that doesn't go anywhere. And this is something that I think we could do a way better job at it. And almost everyone is focusing on the decision-making part, like that should be the end, but not the like, okay, let's talk about the issue and hear everyone's opinions. So.
Yeah, and maybe you did mention the role of meet space and people. And so I'd like to touch on a different direction, that a lot of the time when we're writing about decentralized decision-making, it's always this pseudonymous entities online without real identities coming to some kind of decision. And of course, it's important that we talk about Sybil attacks and all these kind of technical issues and why. But in the real world, there are a lot of people who we know and who we trust, and a lot of people with real-world reputation. That's not some number in some smart contract. And when it comes to sort of the public debates, the role of people like that are really important. And especially if you maybe want, when we don't talk about arbitration, then the identities of the people doing the arbitration are important. And there might definitely be a role for having panels of known people that you can call to, if you want. But sort of this idea that everything has to be pseudonymous, and because we can't guarantee everyone's identity, that means we're not allowed to work with identity at all. I think that's a flawed dichotomy. I don't really know where I'm going with this, but
Freestyle. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, but on the other side, I feel very strongly about like designing this system so that they work in like a completely. If only pseudonymous entities are interacting, and you don't have to rely on knowing someone, or knowing that if they do something bad, you can like sue them in a traditional court. That is very important that we preserve that, and we don't
that's
just.
That's like the hardest case.
Yeah.
Once you've got that, you can.
Yeah, but it's important that we don't design our system saying, okay, we can always fall back into like reputation, because there are like a lot of very interesting use cases for decentralized organizations in which like the people interacting in those organizations, like they cannot reveal their identity, or they would be in big trouble if they do so, or maybe they don't even have like a quote unquote real identity that they cannot KYC with whoever is the centralized KYC provider.
So the mindset is almost we deny ourselves access to these meat space options, and that helps drive the development. Is that?
Well, that's for the security analysis. You always have to assume the worst case. Yeah. You don't know who controls which account and which accounts are controlled by the same entity, and make sure that they can't team up. And so when you're designing your protocols, that's the use case you want to secure yourself against. But that doesn't mean that most of the day-to-day use will be different. If we're running a colony, yes, there might be a huge colony, but it's divided into departments and sub-departments or domains, and there could be work groups. And when you're working with, a small work group every day, you know exactly who you're working with. You talk to these guys every day. You have conversations. You don't need, So in that small context, it's no longer the adversarial pseudonymous context. It will be when you go to larger and larger groups, but you don't want to add complexity that makes it harder for people to work together when they know each other and don't need, every possible safeguard against Sybil attacks when there's 5 people that know each other. And so to fluidly allow, the transition between them is very important. So that's been one of our guiding principles: make it easy to just get stuff done,
right,
but be secure in those adversary cases when you need it. But it's only as needed. Otherwise, you get, I come from academia, and if you've ever been to a university student parliament, you know how voting and procedure can be the most horrendous experiences. They're torturous, they're slow, and they never get anything done. And we definitely don't want that. And so we find the governance, smart contracts, they should help shoehorn a bunch of people into a certain direction to get things moving forward, but should never, you don't want a vote-a-thon every week.
Right. Cool. I want to go back to something, Jorge, that you said before about when we were discussing value judgments about different paradigms. And one of the things I think you said was how good it is for the organization, or words to that effect. And I want to talk about the problem of self-destruction and ask, is it a problem, right? So to compare it with a well-known governance paradigm, the US Constitution, no matter how sorely it is being tested right now, it's bearing up pretty well because it has, sufficient checks, balances. It's thought ahead about the problem of someone coming from within through the system, using the procedures and governance, and then doing malicious or nefarious activity which undermines that process, potentially to the point of non-existence, right? So you've got in the real world, if you like, you've got that example. What does on-chain governance have to say, or does it even need to say anything about the self-destruct problem that, for example, people could vote according to the proposals are made, they're voted on, and before you know it, the organization, the DAO, has changed out of all recognition, leaving the original community just wondering where it went.
Yeah, I think having if that was if everyone involved understood that that could be an outcome, and the organization ends up deciding to self-destruct or transform into a totally different thing, I think that's totally fine, and we should definitely allow that. I think a very very important property of any governance system is that it has the ability to upgrade itself to something else that potentially is better, but. Yeah, if you try to stick to, okay, this is the governance model that we had at the beginning, and we're going to stick with it for as long as the organization lives, I think that could become more of a threat than the threat of, okay, we can evolve how the organization is working, and if that ends up in a very dark place, then that's definitely unfortunate. But you can always have the safeguards that we were talking before about protecting about very bad outcomes or abuses within the system.
Yeah, there's at least 2 kinds of decision, right? There's the kind of decision that we're using our rules to come to decisions on whatever we do every day, And then there's the kind of decisions to change the rules by which we come to everyday decisions, like passing a law and passing a constitutional amendment, to go by your example. And both of those have to have certain thresholds built in. Like, it should be much harder to change the rules than to come to a decision on something within the rules. And to find the right balance, it's not always easy. So if it's too easy to change the rules of decision making, then you can easily get, it should be easier for somebody to gain an undue majority and just take over an organization. If it's too hard, you run the risk that the procedure loses legitimacy because you've got an overwhelming majority that wants to go one way and the rules just say you can't, because then they will just, I mean, you call it revolution on one side and hard fork on the other, but it's essentially the same thing. When the decision-making procedure no longer allows for what you have a very wide consensus to do, then it's the decision-making procedure that loses out and not, the 90% majority. So, yeah, those two levels definitely exist in Colony and in Aragon as well, and it should be much harder to change the rules than to use the rules, but both of them have to be adaptable.
And so the threshold criteria for changing the rules, for example, would be particular types of majority, or what are the actual concrete ideas around what do these training wheels or these safeguards actually look like? I don't know if these are questions that you've tackled yet.
Well, the exact thresholds are not set in stone yet, because that'll be a lot of empirical data that we need to determine. We have a procedure for rolling out this kind of stuff, where we imagine that at first any changes to the rules are controlled by us. When we're programming Colony, we're not going to give it all to a DAO and see how it works. There'll be a special colony that runs the network, and at first it can come up with changes to the rules, but we'll have to explicitly allow them. Then in the next stage, the colony can come up with changes to the rules, and we still retain a veto to make sure that nothing's breaking too much, and then sort of slowly we're ceding control to a decentralized mechanism because we don't know if these thresholds are set right. We don't know if it's a 2/3 majority or a 90% majority that you need, because this kind of stuff, like, there's not enough empirical data out there for how large groups of crypto nerds interact, right? And we'll see. It'll be exciting to see once we're launched, just to collect all this empirical data. And we all came up with some thresholds for decision making: 60% here, 2/3 there, 80%. But those are guesswork. I mean, they're not random choices, but there are some sense arbitrary. And we're really looking forward to seeing how they work and adapting as we move forward. Like, this is version 1 we're rolling out. It's not by any means the final.
Never finished. But in terms of that sort of reducing the footprint, does that describe Aragon's process similarly, or do you approach it differently?
Yeah, as for the individual organizations themselves, like, of course they can set their own thresholds for like how different changes in their organization might look like. There's also the challenge that it's hard to know, it's impossible to know on chain whether like an upgrade to a governance model is upgrading to the same system but like without a bug that was there, or like it was like a purely technical change, or was it like a change in to the rules of the game. And as for the big Aragon network or DAO, we're thinking a similar way, slightly reversed, in which like at the beginning we will have the foundation propose the changes to the governance of the network, and then we will have veto power by the token holders, signaling like, hey, we really don't want this, and then slowly transition to a fully decentralized model without the training wheels.
Very interesting. So I'd like to move to a sort of a discrete area of governance models, which is how proposals are formed, and what sort of goes into that sausage, if you like. Is it because the problems with plebiscites, with referenda, we know are manifold, and they usually center around the framing of the question. Is there some learning from Colony and Aragon on how these things might go down better or be made to function more effectively?
Yeah, I mean, like, to any proposal, there's like two parts to it. One is like what it's actually going to happen, and you can like check that, like, okay, if this proposal is passed, then we're automatically going to execute the following action that has the following side effects. But then, of course, you have the like explaining of like what is actually going to happen, why is this proposal being made, and all that.
Well, there's very different types of proposals, so I don't really know what. So any time you want to do an action in Colony, you're essentially proposing that you're going to do it, but unless anyone objects, it's just going to happen. So there's times when the proposal is just me doing something, say, hey, as agreed, I'm going to do this work, and you create that, and that's fine. There's other instances where we really want to harness sort of a wisdom of the crowds. One of the things we've been talking about recently is budgeting. Like, how do you collectively determine which parts of a colony need how much budget? And that's hard. So it's not going to be that somebody just comes up with the numbers, puts up a proposal, and we all vote on it, because maybe you'll have 20 different proposals and nobody, it'll be very hard for people to judge which one is best. So there's other games we can play to sort of tease out what the collective feeling is for which departments are how important to a colony and which ones need more funding. So that's like the creating of the proposal is separate from the deciding on the proposal. But you were asking, I think, more in general.
My question was more, and it might be, I might have conceived of it wrong, but how do you stop through an otherwise legitimate process a badly phrased or half thought through thing being put to a vote, which may then have negative consequences? Are there ways to specify the forms of the questions that have to be asked? Or I have half in mind, and Lane knows all about this, the process for submitting an EIP. It's only if it comes in a certain form that it really gets the traction that it's then brought into the process. Is there some equivalent here that needs similar safeguarding, or not so much?
Well, that's a policy you could have, and you should have, but the policing of that would have to be social. That any time somebody puts a proposal that doesn't match your rules, somebody just flags it, and as long as everyone agrees to automatically delete and reject the ones that don't pass the format, then that's socially enforced, because it's not something you're going to write contracts for to parse. So there is rules. There's a role for that, and there's a role for coming to high-level agreements, sort of in human language, about what kind of things you want to allow or not allow. But then it falls to the collective to police those rules. Now, within a colony, definitely you can disincentivize going against those rules, because every time you get your stuff deleted and voted down by everyone else, you will lose reputation, you will lose your voting weight. So you can't just sort of maliciously do this over and over again to annoy people. But there's no automated way to reject these kind of proposals. It has to be, the community.
Yeah, but the good thing, as I was touching upon before, is that when a proposal is being made, like, you can be sure, like, if this passes, what are the side effects exactly? In the same way that you can make sure that the procedure was followed, like, point by point. Do you know exactly what the side effects are? So, like, the human, understandable proposal is somewhat less important, because, like, you can know, okay, this is what's going to happen, and there's no other way this could go.
The worst case scenario is no.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that almost brings us to the end of the time. We've got time for a question, or no? One. A question. Hey. Hi.
Can you guys turn this mic on here? Number one.
It's a pretty broad question, but I'm just curious on both of your thoughts about how you foresee this playing out inside of the sort of regulatory environment. Sort of, how do you see these entities fitting into just regular societal structures, legal structures, sorry, like how does it play out with the courts? How does it fit into, the German legal system?
Yeah, I think the beautiful part of it is that it doesn't need to fit with the existing legal system. It's something that if people are interested in using and it has real advantages in organizing this way, people are just going to do it. If you need like some sort of compatibility with the real world and to have like people with like contracts, you can always like have special types of legal entities that recognize that all the decision making and all the executive power is held by this organization. But yeah, this is definitely the compatibility is not needed, but if people really want it, it can happen.
Well, so I think it's very important to ask these questions, especially when one of these decentralized organizations holds real-world assets. I mean, it's fine when we're just moving crypto tokens, but when we own offices and vehicles and whatever, they will all be subject to some local jurisdiction. And the interplay between what's happening on chain and what's happening in these local jurisdictions is it's hard, and it also depends on the legal systems have to adapt to determine whether whether a colony can have legal standing in Germany, and right now it can't. But there's I talk to lawyers every once in a while. I get asked to speak at like law schools because they're really interested in the interplay of smart contracts and legal contracts. And as that develops, I can imagine that something like when you have standard contracts with arbitration clauses that follow certain rules, if there's some representation of that in Ethereum, it would be really easy to add those clauses to a colony contract saying anything in this colony can be appealed to this set of smart contracts which are recognized by the German legal system because the appeals go to German courts. Or you could have, so it's really like this legal system as a service on chain, but there has to be movement on both sides. So right now, if there's no way to have a smart contract organization have a legal standing in any jurisdiction, then there's nothing we can do. I'd really like to see this move forward. I don't think we should be pirates on the interweb the entire time, but but there'll be a lot of synergies both ways. But without changes in laws, it's kind of ad hoc, and it's similar to like the exchanges are the pain points right now for just the currency app. The change between government currencies and ether currencies, they're very hard, and maybe we'll see some of those like pinpoints, like some lawyers and not lawyers. Notaries or something who will officially run a company or a club or a Stiftung or Verein somewhere, and they will faithfully execute whatever is decided on chain, but they will implement it as an off-chain fashion. Those translating organizations, I think that'll be like the first step. But over time, as the legal systems adapt and integrate more in this space, I think we'll see more hybrid organizations and more, we'll learn from each other.
Wonderful. Right. Thanks so much, guys. We don't want to be chased off by Tupac, so we'll leave it there. Thanks.